Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone, wherever you are in the world today. We hope that you're well and healthy and hanging in. And let's crack on with today's webinar. So I'm Gary Hodgson, and I'm delighted to be introducing today's iCoach Kids Shares live webinar number 25. We're really cooking on gas now. Behind the scenes, we have Barnaby Sargent-Megix, who without none of this would happen. So thanks, Barney. And also with me, I have Declan O'Leary of Sport Island Coaching. Hi, Dec.
Hi, Gary, and thank you. Hi, all, and thank you for making the time to join us. Today, we are going to explore the topic of skill acquisition in youth sport with two fantastic guests. But before we meet them, back to Gary for some housekeeping.
Thanks, Declan. So just a reminder again, for those of you who have recently joined us, please be mindful to keep cameras and microphones off for the time being. But any questions that you have, please either submit them in the chat function here on Zoom, or if you're watching live on YouTube, please type your questions there and we'll collate those to ask our guests shortly. Now, let me first explain how this session will run. So we'll introduce our guests and hear them present their work. And following both presentations, we'll start asking some questions to the speakers, and then we'll bring the questions that the audience are asking. So to set the scene for today's webinar, I'm going to hand back over to Declan.
Thanks again, Gary. We're going to look at skill acquisition in youth sport, and skill acquisition is the sub-discipline of the sport and exercise sciences that deals with the learning, refining and performing of skills, which helps coaches to ensure that practice is efficient and as effective as possible throughout the lifespan of a player or athlete. To help develop skillful players and athletes, we need to consider how individuals are practicing, how do they think and act during our sessions. Skillful learners practice in a fundamentally different way, which accelerates their learning. This webinar will examine the processes that skillful learners use to enhance the quality of their practice, and how coaches can help the players, athletes they work with develop into skillful learners, and the role of perceptual cognitive skills in allowing youth participants to perform at their maximum. And to introduce our first guest, I'm going to hand you back to Gary.
Thanks, Declan. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. David Alder of Leeds Beckett University, someone who has been a colleague and a friend of mine for quite some time now. Dave completed his PhD in 2014 at Liverpool John Moores University. His PhD was funded by the EIS, so the English Institute of Sport, and he examined the influence of anxiety on anticipation and decision-making of elite athletes. He's currently a senior lecturer at Leeds Beckett, and he has been since 2014, and currently leads on all performance analysis modules along with several other coaching topics. He's been an academy football coach at a range of professional clubs since 2010, and also holds his UEFA B licence and full youth award. And he's also currently a talent reporter for the Football Association, working with the under-15s and under-18 national age groups. An exciting time to be involved in English football, I imagine. So Dave, welcome to the iCoach Kids Shares webinar series, and over to you.
Good afternoon, thank you, Gary. I'll just share my screen. Is that sharing okay, guys?
That's perfect.
Lovely. Okay, so we'll get started. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation to come and speak to you today. As Gary mentioned, I have been working with him since 2014, so I wasn't sure what sort of introduction he was going to give me. So I wanted to give a brief one myself just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So as Gav mentioned, I've been at Leeds Beckett since 2014, academy coach for various professional clubs for between 8 and 10 years, and most recently working in the YDP phase essentially as a scout for the FA. Currently working towards my Advanced Youth Award as well. So in terms of where I want to take this presentation over the next 15 or 20 minutes or so, mainly touching on 3 different topics. So first of all, I want to talk through what are perceptual cognitive skills, why they're important for youth athletes, and essentially define some of the characteristics that allow elite athletes to be able to develop and perform at such a high level. I'm going to talk through what actually impacts perceptual cognitive skills in training and in game situations. And then finally going to finish the piece by providing some real clear practical tips for developing said perceptual cognitive skills. So in terms of a brief background to perceptual cognitive skills and the work as a whole, in the seminal work by the infamous Tom Riley in the early 2000s, when we compare truly elite and sub-elite players, tend to find that there aren't that many differences from a physical point of view. So physiologically, they're quite similar, anthropometrically, they're quite similar, and then finally, biomechanically, they're quite similar. So when we're comparing the elite and the truly elite, there's not a massive difference in these sorts of variables. From a psychosocial point of view, there begins to be a little bit more of a difference in that there begins to be elements of mental toughness and ability to work in group dynamics that begin to differentiate between elite and truly elite. But the biggest marker and that holds the biggest difference is perceptual cognitive skill. So the ability to locate, identify, and process information from the environment in order to select and complete correct actions. So the work from Riley et al. Shows that at the truly elite level, the difference between athletes is the ability to perceive information in the environment to then execute an effective action. And we know that these perceptual cognitive skills these perceptual cognitive skills are made up of a range of different factors. So elite athletes are able to chunk information more effectively. They're able to recognize patterns quicker, and they're able to detect deceptive movement. But one perceptual cognitive skill I'm going to focus on, and my work's focused on over the last 5 years, has been anticipation. So the ability to predict upcoming opponent actions to allow sufficient time to respond. For me, the most important part of this definition is the second part of the statement. So it's no good being able to predict what's happening if you do it too late and don't allow the athlete appropriate time to respond in an effective manner. So we know that elite athletes are better at anticipating actions than sub-elite athletes, and they do this by a variety of different means. So first of all, they're able to better identify contextual information quicker. So that may be playing against a particular opponent, it may be playing against a particular formation. Whatever it is, elite athletes are able to contextualize information quicker and to be able to make clear and decisive actions as a result. They're also able to recognize patterns quicker. So the original work from Chase and Simon in Grandmaster chess players has been replicated in a range of sports, most recently by Jamie North, in which elite athletes are able to recognize pictures quicker, which then allows them more time to respond. And a final means in which they can anticipate action, and one in which the majority of my research is focused, is postural cue usage. So the ability of athletes to pick up subtle postural cues that are emanating from an opponent in order to predict what is about to happen. And athletes do this by being able to identify areas of the display in which to fixate their vision on. So elite athletes are able to identify where to look and, more importantly, when. So a nice paper which has demonstrated this quite clearly is from Savelsberg et al. In 2002, in which they tasked elite, so expert and novice goalkeepers with trying to save penalty kicks. In the 1500 to 500 milliseconds pre-ball contact, so this is once the taker has marked out their run-up, they found that experts tended to fixate on the shoulders and the head, whereas novices fixated more on the torso and the trunk. As the kicker then approached the ball, you can see that novices tend to focus on similar sort of areas, whereas experts have now shifted their vision to more discriminating parts of the display in which they can begin to unpick and interpret information. These differences in visual search behavior are also underpinned by differences in response accuracy. So the experts are able to save more penalties. So from this work, we can see that perceptual cognitive skills are important, but also the visual search that underpins those skills is expertise specific. Whilst pulling together this presentation, most of my work has been working with elite level adults. So have a look at the literature base around, well, are perceptual cognitive skills important in youth athletes? Can they be developed, etc.? There's a growing body of evidence that suggests that regardless of sport type, perceptual cognitive skills can discriminate between skilled and less skilled youth players, and they can also be accelerated across the learning process. So we know that perceptual cognitive skills are vitally important in the adult elite version of the game, but work's beginning to show that actually it can differentiate skillful youth players as well. So therefore, if we can identify ways in which to accelerate that learning process, then we can put our athletes in the best place to develop their potential. We also know that a lot goes on in a game or a competition. It's not an isolated event in which our participants aren't experiencing outside pressures. So we know that from a perceptual cognitive point of view, there are a range of factors that can impact the ability to anticipate action. So anxiety has been shown to negatively impact it, fatigue, lack of sleep, and altitude, amongst a range of other factors, have all been shown to lead to a decrement in perceptual cognitive skill. And interestingly, regardless of expertise, there is still that effect. So even elite level athletes suffer with these different stresses in their environment that negatively impacts their performance. There's a nice piece of work from Nieuwenhuis and Udejans a couple of years ago that tried to actually get to the root cause of this. So what is it that's actually causing these detrimental effects to occur? And due to the time constraints of the presentation, I won't go into lots of details on this work, but for me, these are the 4 key areas that came out of this work. So when feeling anxious or stressed or tired, players may look in the same places for information, but they may not be able to extract or process the information they're looking at. They may be distracted and fixate on irrelevant cues. So whereas we spoke about before that elite athletes are able to identify the correct area to be focusing upon, when anxiety or low physical load is introduced, this may then interrupt this system and allow them to focus on irrelevant cues. Interestingly as well, when experiencing these stresses, work's shown that they actually have to recruit additional effort to maintain the same performance. So even though an athlete may be completing exactly the same task, when they are feeling levels of anxiety or fatigue, they have to recruit additional mental and physical effort to maintain performance. And some of that effort may actually lead not only to maintaining performance, but looking at trying to disrupt or stop the feeling of said stressor. So we know that perceptual cognitive skills are important. We know that they're negatively impacted by a range of stresses. So therefore, we need to work out, well, how can we put in place training interventions to allow our athletes to be robust and to stop these debilitating effects happening in the first place? And that's where some of our work in badminton comes in. So a funded project a few years ago from the Badminton World Federation, we wanted to examine, well, if we know players make poor decisions or poor anticipatory judgments when they're tired, what happens if we get to train them at those levels of tiredness or those levels of physical fatigue and then look to develop decision making? So in terms of a real brief outline of the study, in phase 1, when we put players in physically demanding situations, anticipatory skill decreased. So when they're tired, decision-making anticipation decreased. We then put them through a bit of a beasting. So weekly training sessions in which they were training at heart rate max of higher than 85% whilst completing some form of decision-making training. Once we've done that, we then put them back into the similar sort of thing from phase 1 to see, well, actually, can we transfer the training effects into a competition-like environment? And we could. So we found that by training with high levels of fatigue, that protected the decision-making processes from detrimental effects of physical load. So that's from a physical load point of view. The next piece of work that we completed was, what about from an anxiety point of view? So the example from Wimbledon a couple of days ago around anxiety overcoming an athlete so that they can't perform anymore. What happens if we get them training under an anxious state? Is there any transfer to performance? And again, a very similar layout to the study I just presented. In phase 1 of the study, we found that when players are anxious, so when we gave them a traditional anxiety-inducing type environment, there's a massive drop in anticipatory skill, and again, the mechanisms that underpinned it, such as visual search, changed. Players then went through a range of anxiety, what we call anxiety training methods, in which they look to develop decision-making whilst under those anxiety levels. And then again, as per the one I've just shared, we found that by doing this, it allowed them to be more robust and protect against the negative effects of anxiety. So we know that perceptual cognitive skills are important. We know that they can be impacted negatively as a result of various stresses within the environment. And these 2 pieces of work show that if you get your athletes or your participants to train under the sorts of load that they're going to feature or face in a game, then it will allow them to maintain performance when they feel in those similar situations further down the line. So in terms of real practical takeaway messages, for me, the first one would be get the load or make sure the load mirrors the situation that the athletes are going to find themselves in. So although I've spoken about perceptual cognitive type interventions here, a real practical example from Leicester City from the year that they won the Premier League, they had a record low number of hamstring issues and injuries. When you consider the way in which Leicester City play in terms of their repeated sprints, their counter-attacking style, their high-intensity pressing type approach, this is sort of quite contradictory. But when you hear the head of sports science speak, and he talked through how at the end of training sessions, he used to get players to do repeated sprints so that the body became used to performing in the situation that they're going to find themselves in again. And for me, the work I've just presented mirrors this. So if our players are going to feel fatigued or anxious during a game, we need to make sure that they're feeling those same levels of stress in a training situation. On a related topic, I've not touched on it today, from a technical point of view, if our players' technique is breaking down near the end of the game because they're tired, maybe we need to think about, well, when am I doing my technical practices? More often than not, and from my context, technical practices tend to take place at the beginning of a session, when players are fresh, mentally and physically. When in fact, what would happen if we put the technical practice at the end of the session? What would happen to the technique when they're actually fatigued mentally and physically? So the first takeaway message would be make sure that the load that you put on them in training matches that of a game. And the second one would be, once we've got the environment around the load right, make sure that the practice that you get your performers to be completing encourages the behavior that you want to see. So from an invasion type game, this could be any game with a ball, really. A real basic example of 3 players, player on the left passes to the player in the middle passes to the player on the right. Been done thousands of times. And how often do you hear coaches screaming, check your shoulder, scan, pictures, all the buzzwords that used to drive me crazy in academy football. But the players in these examples don't have to scan. They don't have to perceive any information because the practice isn't forcing them to. In no way are they rewarded for scanning or perceiving the environment. So therefore, a really simple, subtle change could be that before the ball's played into the centre man, the player on the far right-hand side can move to either the cone at the top or the cone at the bottom. Once he's done that, the player in the middle has to go to the opposite side. The ball then, the pattern is exactly the same, and the technical practice can continue. But by doing this sort of behaviour, this sort of approach, it's forcing your players, it's forcing the participants to adapt and use the perceptual cognitive skill that they've got, but it allows them to develop that in the future as well. So the 2 main takeaways from this presentation: make sure that the load matches the situation, whether that's mentally, whether that's physically. And then secondly, make sure that your practice really does encourage your participants to use the behaviour that you want them to use. More than happy to share references with people afterwards if needs be. Apologies for speaking really quickly there, Gary. I just wanted to get through everything and stick to time. I'll hand you back over to host Gary Hobson.
Dave, certainly no need to apologise. What a fantastic presentation. And I'm sure the rest of the audience will appreciate the insights that you've offered there. I'm going to hand over to Declan now, who is going to introduce Phil Caney.
Thanks very much, Gary. Phil is the course director for the Masters in Sports Science in Applied Sports Coaching at the University of Limerick in Ireland. Phil received his PhD from the University of Limerick in 2009, investigating how applied skill acquisition principles could accelerate the development of children's fundamental movement skills. He then taught at the University of Chichester from 2009 to 2017, where he was program coordinator for the BSc in Sports Science and Coaching. Phil returned to the University of Limerick in 2017. He is a fellow of the Higher Education Authority, and Phil's research and teaching focus is on skill acquisition and youth sport, particularly in the context of developing track and field athletics. Phil is a co-founder of Movement and Skill Acquisition Ireland and holds the athletics coach qualification from UK Athletics. Welcome, Phil, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Declan. So, you could just let me know if my screen is sharing there, okay?
It certainly is.
Wonderful, thank you very much. And thank you very much for the invitation to present today as well. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to talk to you about a topic that I'm very passionate about. This is one of my favorite topics within skill acquisition. I hope we're going to have a good Q&A afterwards, but if you have further questions or if you're watching this later on YouTube, my contact details are on the screen, and please feel free to reach out to me. Now, most of the research on skill acquisition focuses on the coach. How does the coach design better activities? How can a coach deliver better feedback? But today I want to focus on the individual learner. So what can the learner do to accelerate his or her development? Here's my take-home message. The individual who is good at learning, what I'm calling the skillful learner, is more likely to become a skillful gymnast or a skillful footballer or cricketer or softball player or boxer or hockey player. We want to develop skillful players. Players who feel that they are skillful are more likely to stay playing the game. Players who are more skillful are more likely to progress within the sport. So to help develop skillful players, I'm suggesting that we as coaches need to concentrate on how players are practicing. How do they think? How do they act during a practice session? Because not all practice is equal. Players have a major influence on how much they learn within each session by the way that they think and the way that they act. Think about a young person that you coach who, because of the way he or she thinks and acts inside training sessions, gets as much learning as they can out of every session. This might not be the best person within the group, but it's the person that, if they keep going as they are, they're going to make the absolute most out of their potential. Those kinds of players are what I want to discuss today. I'm going to try and answer a few key questions around this idea of skillful learning. So first off, what exactly do skillful learners do? What does that look like within your context? And how can you help to develop more skillful learners? In any sport, any task, any group of individuals, some people will learn faster than others. Now, why is that? When we're dealing with human beings, the answer is always going to be complicated. There's always going to be lots of different aspects which provide some part of an answer. But there are now a range of studies that have closely examined what players of different levels think and do when they are practicing. And that has revealed part of the answer as to why some people learn faster than others. It's also revealed that actually many learners don't engage in very effective practice behaviors, but some do. And those individuals whose learning is faster and more robust, those that I'm calling skillful learners, they practice in a different way and across a whole range of sports. So on the screen, this is coming from Gaelic football, from volleyball, from basketball. There's other research in figure skating and golf. Across all of these sports, we see some common differences in how expert learners, skillful learners practice that distinguishes them from individuals who aren't learning as quickly. And these are some of the processes that are different. Now, it doesn't matter if we're looking at sport or music or writing or drama or academic study in school or university. The processes that you see listed on the screen are examples of what skillful learners do that accelerates their learning. Collectively, these are known in the literature as self-regulatory strategies, strategies by which individuals can enhance their learning. So what I'm going to do is talk through a few examples of what these processes look like. And as I do so, it'd be good for you to think about, well, how does this apply within my context? Time management is an obvious one. How much time during practice is spent on things that you can already do quite well versus how much time is spent on challenging tasks? Skillful learners spend more of their time pushing the boundaries of what they can do within their practice sessions. In terms of structuring the environment, if a goalkeeper in rugby is working on something new, she might go down to a quiet area of the pitch where she can focus on playing around with this different way of kicking and do so without distractions. If that same kicker is interested in testing how well she's learned what she's been working on, well, she might go to a busy section of the pitch or go down to a section where there's lots of distractions around, so she can concentrate on shutting out those distractions and delivering a performance. Skillful learners deliberately pick environments in which they practice, which will help them to achieve their aims. Goal setting is another key example. So skillful learners set specific process goals. Consider a golfer who is consistently under-hitting putts, leaving the ball short of the hole. So she arranges a putting drill where the focus is on controlling length, and her goal is that 8 out of 10 putts either go into the hole or they go past the hole. So skillful learners set specific goals to identify what they need to work on, and then they arrange practices which are designed to help them achieve those specific process goals. Self-instruction is also something that we hear a lot from skillful learners. They talk to themselves more. They use cues or reminders as to what it is they need to focus their attention on. Our golfer might say, give it a chance, reminding herself that a putt that lands short can never make the hole, so she's using just a little cue to remember what it is that she needs to do. Or it might be more specifically related to some other aspect of the movement. But self-instruction is something that we hear a lot when we are dealing with skillful learners. Help seeking? Absolutely. Skillful learners more often reach out to coaches, to other athletes to confirm that they're on the right path with what they're doing, or to ask for advice on what or how to practice, or even just be more attentive in observing what other people are doing. Skillful learners apply consequences. So thinking about our golfer again, she might think, if I make 8 out of 10 putts, I can spend 5 minutes trying that Phil Mickelson shot out of the bunker. If I don't, I'm going to work on this for a little bit more. Critically, it's the learner who decides what an appropriately challenging standard is and what an appropriate consequence is. That doesn't get imposed from the outside. It's the learner taking responsibility for setting those consequences. Task strategies, typically more sport specific. Amplification of error is a nice example. So if a learner makes a particular error and it's relatively new, they're exploring the skill, well, then they might repeat and exaggerate that error before then performing the appropriate action. Because amplifying the error and comparing that to the action they're looking to perform gives them the ability to more easily distinguish between the two, to understand the feeling of the movement that they're looking for. Or another task strategy might be to perform an action with the eyes closed, again, to help them to tune in to what this movement should feel like. Skillful learners have a broader range of answers to the question, what can you do to help you learn this task? And it's not the case that they will do all of these strategies all of the time, but skillful learners are picking appropriate strategies that are helping them to learn the task at any moment. Self-monitoring, it just refers to how skillful learners tend to be tuned into what they're doing, and they're able to connect their movements to the outcomes. Thinking back to our golfer, why did that putt end up short? Was it the length of the backswing? Was it the acceleration through contact? What happened there exactly? Skillful learners are more likely to give specific answers to the question, why did that happen? Both for positive actions and for errors. So across all of these domains, skillful learners have been shown to make more and more sophisticated use of all of these processes than less effective learners. So we know that some people learn faster than others. We know that the reason why some people learn faster than others is because of the specific processes that they use, the task strategies, the goal setting, the help seeking. A really important question is whether individuals can learn to be a more skillful learner. I draw on two sources to answer this question. So first of all, I have run consultancy sessions with a range of coaching groups and academies where we talk about their experiences of players through their development. And one of the questions I ask is, have you noticed a player who initially was not very effective at practicing, but by the end of their time with your group had become much better in terms of how they manage their practice, much better in terms of their thoughts, their actions, their practice behavior? And the answer is always yes. People can think of specific examples of where individuals have changed. And that's supported by the experimental literature that you see on the screen. So research that has explicitly tried to teach these processes, teach how to practice to individuals, has then looked at, okay, does that improve their learning in the sport? And does that improve their future practice behavior? The research that I've got listed on the screen comes from physical education settings, it comes from adolescents engaged in team sport, and it comes from high-performing adolescent golfers at an academy setting. And in all of these contexts, explicitly teaching individuals how to practice can accelerate their learning, and it improves their practice behavior down the line as well. So they're learning how to learn their sport more effectively. So a really important question for coaches to consider is, do you go beyond teaching athletes what to learn? Do you go beyond teaching them the sport? Do you teach your athletes, your players, how to learn? How do you do that? Now, there are different ways that you can teach individuals how to learn. You might find an athlete using self-talk within your session. And so you could praise that and you can ask them about how they could use similar self-talk in another activity. So we'll call that opportunistic development. You see a moment, a teachable moment, and you act upon it. But you could also take a more structured approach. So here's an example of a particular strategy that has received a lot of attention within the skill acquisition literature. It was developed by an American psychologist called Robert Singer. And this strategy is a great conversation starter. That's what I'm really going to emphasize. This is a conversation starter about how to engage in high quality practice. It's designed for use with self-paced skills. So you determine when to start the activity. Think about golfing, many athletic disciplines, free kick, basketball free throw, that kind of thing. So for example, a netball shooter might get ready by adopting a particular stance and slowly exhaling a deep breath. They might image themselves scoring the shot as though they were watching themselves on television. They then narrow down their focus. So maybe they select a particular point on the hoop and they narrow their focus to just that. Now, if they've done step 1, 2, and 3 appropriately, then everything's ready. The movement just needs to be released and it should run through and happen. So Singer emphasizes that step 4, you execute without trying to control your actions, without trying to control the step-by-step elements, just let it happen. And then finally, and a very intensive and time-consuming element of the strategy, you thoroughly evaluate what just happened. So you are evaluating, was I ready before attempting that throw? Did I get myself to the appropriate physical and psychological state to execute a good attempt? What about my imagery? Was that clear? Was that a solid image of what I wanted to be executing within this trial? Was I focused on an appropriate point? Did I maintain that focus sufficiently? And so on. I've written more about this particular approach in a blog for Athletics Ireland, and the QR code on the screen should take you there. But one of the reasons I really like the strategy as an introduction is because there are so many ways that you can individualize the strategy. So there are many different ways to get ready. Different individuals can decide upon different steps that they might take to get them physically and mentally ready to perform. Likewise with imagery. Are you going to look from an external perspective, as though you're seeing yourself on television, or from an internal perspective, what you see looking through your own eyes? Or are you going to concentrate on the feel of the movement rather than a visual image? So there are lots of different ways that an individual can play with and develop an individual strategy. But the Singer's 5-step routine, it gives a really nice framework to start with that. Now, the idea is not that all athletes will now execute all 5 steps on every single attempt from now on. Instead, learning to apply this strategy provides coaches and athletes with a common framework around which they can discuss what does quality practice look like, what are the different aspects that could be included, and together you can evolve an individual approach to quality practice from there. Singer's 5-step approach might be familiar to anybody who has come across performance routines. And if an athlete has a routine to help them perform in competition, then they definitely have some of the mental skills around focusing and imagery that will help them to learn more effectively. You just apply these mental skills in a slightly different way. So for example, when performing, your imagery might be more focused on the outcome, it might be more holistic. Whereas when learning, you might be more specific in your imagery, and it might be more targeted towards a specific technical element. In competition, your evaluation is likely to be quite brief because you have to get back in the game. Whereas during practice sessions, the evaluation should be extensive. So there are differences between performance routines and learning strategies, but they are drawing on many of the basic skills. And if you're interested in the differences between routines and strategies, there's a couple of references on the screen that are quite good for that. I mentioned at the start that I'm really passionate about this idea of skillful learning, and there's a couple of reasons for that. The first is that I think anybody can benefit from learning how to practice more effectively. So this is really accessible. The second reason is that what you learn within sport about how to practice more effectively can be transferred outside of sport. I mentioned earlier about all the different domains where we see skillful learners share these common processes within how they practice. So what we learn within sport about how to engage in quality practice can be beneficial when studying at school or university, or it should save you money on your driving lessons. But, and as it was really well highlighted on an earlier talk within the I Coach Kids World series from Ian Cowburn and Martin Camaret, life skills from sport do not automatically transfer. And I think learning to learn is definitely one of these really important life skills. But it has to be encouraged. It has to be prompted. There needs to be a discussion as to how the lessons from learning how to practice more effectively in sport can be applied in, say, your academic studying, and vice versa. What are the lessons from your music teacher that could enhance how you practice within sport? So it should be a two-way discussion, I think. If you haven't seen that life skills presentation, thoroughly recommended. There's some really nice lessons within there, and they link to some excellent resources around life skills. So here's a suggestion for after the session, just to try and help you to take some of these ideas on board and bring them into your own coaching practice. Spend about 15 minutes and just fill out this table. I'm very confident that if I came along and watched one of your coaching sessions, I would find lots of examples where you already teach players how to learn to some extent. So hopefully today has given you some ideas about how you could do this even more, how you could enhance what they're doing. And likewise, I'd encourage you to think about what you currently do to transfer ideas about how to learn from sport, and encourage your players, your athletes, to apply those lessons about quality practice outside of sport. So I'll finish on my wrap-up message as well. If we concentrate on developing skillful learners, I think we will increase the likelihood of developing skillful players. And there's a range of processes that I've identified that skillful learners show across lots of different domains. These can be taught, these should be taught, and we should encourage learners to transfer this beyond sport as well. If you're already developing skillful learners, I'd love to hear examples from you. If after this presentation you decide to explore this more, again, I'd love to hear how you get on. Thanks very much for your time, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thanks for that, Phil. What a fantastic presentation, which not only included some really useful strategies for coaches to implement, but also a really useful plug of the iCoach Kids content and the other webinars that are available on our YouTube channel. So thank you very much. So we're going to go to some questions now from myself and Declan. And while we ask these questions over the next few minutes, I really encourage our audience to engage with the chat function and ask any questions that you have of our presenters. But if I may, I'll start with a question for Dave, if that's all right. Dave, you mentioned about the importance of skillful players recognizing patterns quicker and recognizing postural cues. How do we then help coaches to understand these cues and patterns better to then in the end help players understand those cues too?
Oh, thanks, guys. Nice, easy one to start. I think it all comes back to knowing your sport, and something that we're really is really clear in the degree program that I teach on is if you don't know your sport yourself, how could you possibly then improve and develop players within that sport? Would be my first message, and second would be to watch what the experts do. So whether that's watching an 18-year-old Pedri last night not give the ball away for 90 minutes, whether that's working with a player in your group. It may be that you have a particular player who is particularly good at scanning, particularly good at reading cues. Speak to them. So what are you looking for? Because the patterns that they use and they see may be slightly different. So until you know your sport yourself, and until you know what the experts are doing, then you're going to be sort of floundering in the dark a little bit. But also speaking to your players, because your players are on the grass. They're the ones that are seeing the pictures as opposed to you seeing on the sideline.
And I wonder, Phil, how much of those conversations with players might really start to help learners self-regulate their learning behaviour?
Yeah, I think it's something that ideally you would like to see very much integrated into coaching practice. So I think there will be opportunities within every session for you to see examples of players who are displaying some of these processes. And so little conversations around that, praising opportunities where you see that behavior that you want to promote. I think absolutely that's just, it's something that master coaches do really well and they do automatically. And if you're developing as a coach, it's something to pay attention to. Are you exploiting all of the opportunities that are available to you within your session?
Yeah, Dave, I think you've got a follow-up point there, yeah?
If I may, guys, I think just from a real practical point of view in terms of how to understand pictures and patterns a little bit clearer would be where you stand as a coach is really important. I think if you can get into your session and see what the players are seeing, then it'll allow you to advise and to actually pick out those key cues a little bit easier. So say, for example, I'll stick to the sport that I know. So football, we're looking at playing out from the back, let's say. Rather than standing on the side of the pitch, if you stand either behind the goal or behind one of the players, that you begin to see the patterns that they do. So it allows you to have those conversations with them as opposed to almost second guessing what it is that they're seeing.
Thanks, Dave. I guess one final follow-up question for you then, Dave, would be, you mentioned about the importance of almost simulating some of the in-game feelings within training. And you mentioned anxiety being one of those things that might be simulated. Are there any kind of risks that might be related to elevating these anxieties in training, or are you aware of any kind of safeguards against such risks?
Yeah, really, really important question, guys. I think the work that I presented was all done, obviously following the full ethics process and all that sort of stuff. But I think in terms of increasing anxiety during a training session, I think, it comes back to having conversations with your players. If they know the rationale behind what you're doing, then they're part of the journey. You're doing it with them, not to them, would be my first point. And I think as well, if you look at, there are a range of practical examples of people doing this without actually knowing. So a really clear, good example is Duncan Ferguson at Everton. So at the end of every training session, strikers get one shot to score. That's it. The pressure that the players are feeling there simulates the game, because they might have that on a match day, but it's done in such a way that it's a controlled environment that players understand exactly what the rationale is behind the elevating the load. It's a good question there.
Thank you. No, thank you, Dave. I'm just going to hand over to Declan now to ask some of the questions around his curiosities.
Thanks, Gary. I'll have a follow-on question for Dave as well. We always talk about communication as an important coaching skill. You've used the word conversation a couple of times there. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that, and particularly how it might apply with youth or younger participants?
Yeah, so I think it's conversation intimates that it's two-way. It's not just the coach dictating to the athlete. The athlete isn't just an empty vessel to swallow up knowledge from the coach. And I think if you look at some of the work within sort of transformational leadership and that sort of research output, it suggests that by having these conversations with players, it allows them to engage to a greater degree within the sessions, would be one point. And secondly, I think it's, especially when working with younger players, that they want to be heard. I think the players that I've worked with at academy sessions, they're used to being good at doing, but sometimes they want to have success at saying and talking and being able to show off a little bit. But I think if we give them those opportunities, then it allows them to develop and tie in with the life skills stuff that Phil spoke about, not just developing them as players, but more holistic people. So I think the more we can involve them in the conversation about the game, the better.
Super. That's great. Thanks very much, Dave. Back to you. I'll come over to you, Phil. It strikes me that you're starting to ask more of the learner or the player or the young person in what they're doing. So I think you're expecting them to bring more to the training session than just their gear themselves and be on time. Could you elaborate a little bit more on what your expectation of a learner would be when they come to one of your sessions?
Yeah, that's a really nice question. And I guess the first and most important point to say here is that learners bring a range of different expectations to a session. So some players are coming along, if we think about an athletic session, some players are coming along because they're maybe throwing really well and they've got a number in mind that they're aiming for and they're trying to improve and maybe go for a performance in competition. And at the same session, at the same age group, someone's coming along to have a chat with their friends and they want to be involved in part in the group. And you know what? If they throw a bit further, great. If they don't, that's okay too. They're not that bothered. So the most important message would be to meet the learners where they are and what they actually need. So this is not something that I would be imposing on all learners. I wouldn't certainly be getting all learners to apply Singer's 5-step strategy. What I would be saying is that when a learner is ready to invest more in the quality of their practice and how they practice, then can you as a coach recognize that and respond to their need? And then something like Singer's strategy gives you a really nice framework to respond to their desire to engage in more, more serious-minded practice. So I think that would be a really important aspect of it. However, that doesn't mean that you can't drip feed some of this in earlier on. If you're working with children, can you encourage them to use self-talk? Can you encourage them to use imagery? Absolutely you can, but in more isolated elements. That's certainly something that I would recommend there.
Super stuff. Thanks, Phil. Learning how to learn. It's like when you ask an open question to young players and you have to be really patient while they frame their thoughts, because they're trying to frame thoughts about something that they just don't know. I think, Dave, you said they're good at doing. They just don't know why they're good at doing. So sometimes they need to learn what they're doing, understand it a little bit more, and then they're able to have the type of conversation I think, Dave, you refer to. But as you say, Phil, when they're young, you can drip feed. And I think that's a very good suggestion, that it might be a case of you asking them to think on one aspect of Singer's model because you feel it's appropriate for them at the time, and they just take a little bit more away from it. And the last I had, Phil, was...
Sorry, Declan, just to follow up on that maybe a little bit, but even just to think about, what is it you want players to be able to do at 17, 18 years of age? And, that's not something you introduce wham at 17 years of age. Actually, how can you gradually introduce elements of this so that they're ready to have those conversations? They're ready to answer those open questions when it comes to that later stage.
Yeah. And I suppose my last question back perhaps to both of you was, what are the implications of this in terms of the coaching philosophy that a coach might have?
So I'll jump in first, maybe. Philosophies are based on your beliefs and your values. So if your belief is that there are lessons that you can learn from sport that can be applied outside of sport, if that's a belief that you hold, what does that belief look like in practice? It should manifest itself in some kind of behavior that we can observe within your practice. And so that behavior might be conversations with athletes about how they practice in the sport, how this can help them with their studying, how their learning and studying can help them in how they study here. So that's a really specific example. But I guess the important bit for me is that your philosophy is a connection between your values and beliefs and your behaviors as you practice as a coach. And so if this is one of the beliefs that you hold, that sport, you learn lessons for broader life, well, what aspect of your philosophy helps you to bridge that belief to some specific practices?
Thanks very much for that, Phil. I think we're into one of these unknown unknowns for coaches around the complexity of coaching. And I think that if we could introduce it through, for example, the blog you mentioned, Phil, we might get coaches thinking a little bit outside the box and introducing new concepts. Thank you both for those answers, and I'm going to hand you back to Gary now.
Yeah, thank you both. I'm actually going to hand straight back over to Barney, who has been collating the audience questions that have come in, and we've got a few minutes left to be able to discuss those. So Barney, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. Thanks for the couple of people who've submitted questions. Really appreciate that. So first one, and for Phil firstly, but Dave chip in at the end as well after. In a team sport setting, how do you balance a team that has a mixed ability in terms of skillful learning, if some players are slower to learn than others?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Alex. So I think you're always going to find this. I think that the first thing I'll say is it refers back to the answer I gave to Declan in terms of meeting them where they are. So, make sure that those individuals who are ready to learn, ready to invest more heavily in the quality of their practice, that you're helping them to do so, and that players who aren't ready to do that just yet, you're a little bit more patient with. Also recognizing, if you're dealing with adolescents, that they might be ready to invest on a Tuesday and not on a Thursday, and that's perfectly normal. Okay, so you've got to really respond to coaches. The other real advantage of a mixed ability group, or if you've got an opportunity for overlap in ages, is you can encourage people to watch what's happening, watch what the players at the level above are doing. So who are the role models? Have you identified who the role models in the group are, and how can you best use those role models to disseminate some of these quality practice behaviors through the group as a whole?
Great, thanks, Phil. Dave, have you got anything to kind of build on at all, or any other comments on that?
Yeah, just another question. I think I don't how to approach it if we've got a player who's at top of the group from an ability point of view, but at the bottom of the group from a successful learner point of view, and then the other way around. If you've got someone who shows all the characteristics of a skillful learner, but hasn't got the output yet, how to manage those individuals. But I guess that's a big question for now.
Yeah, we'll jump onto one other question because we're kind of getting towards the end, but we'll leave that one there. So a kind of final question for a couple of minutes now. How does deliberate practice impact a player's ability to read cues and perceive actions? Is the accumulation of hours driving the improvement on perception? Or should we as coaches be reducing practice time and focusing more on quality and ways of improving perception in a session? Dave, do you want to crack on with that one for a
That's a great question. Thank you ever sent that through. I think for me, both. I think deliberate practice isn't just about the number of hours. It's about the quality of practice, it being effortful, it being focusing on something that you're not particularly good at as well. So there's no good spending 40,000 hours practicing a skill you can already do. So therefore, it's more about the quality of those practices and making sure that the quality is high, but it's also focused in the right areas. So how often do we as coaches do a practice that looks neat and tidy? Everything's going well, the ball's zipping around, I'm a great coach, stand next to the parents. But actually, if there's no mistakes happening, then the players aren't necessarily learning. So I think it's getting that balance between, yes, getting the quantity of time, but also the quality of those actions as well. And then to build on that, I think it's, again, it depends what your coaching belief is. Do you want your players to see the same picture 500 times in a session, or do you want them to see 500 pictures once? And again, I think depending on which one of those camps you sit in, you'll have to set your expectations of your players accordingly. So I guess it's about that decision making around, I want to expose my athletes to, or my players to dozens of different pictures, but then briefly, or to actually spend longer on specific moments.
And great, thanks, Dave. And Phil, you got anything else to kind of?
Yeah, I just very quickly jump in to say that when we talk about deliberate practice, one of the elements of the definition of deliberate practice is the involvement of a coach, because a coach can help you to identify what the most appropriate practice activity is and can structure that so that it's a practice activity that is targeting the precise shortcoming within your performance. And so I think a really nice answer from Dave, and his research and some of that he cited just shows how you can develop anticipation, you can develop decision making, but it's got to be the right kind of practice and targeted practice. And so while I've talked a lot about what the individual can do for themselves, that's a really nice example of how sometimes you need that knowledgeable coach to assist in the planning of those specific activities.
And if I could come back in there, Barney, if that's okay, just with
absolutely, Dave, yeah.
A real practical example, just thinking about, it's driven by the coach, but it could also be, going back to my second take-home message, driven by the practice that you've designed. So thinking about within my context, a central midfield player who keeps getting caught on the ball because he's not scanning appropriately. Okay, he or she. A practice they could use, rather than the coach leading and dictating, this is what I want you to do, with real subtle rule changes. So say, for example, if the opposition tackle him and score, it's worth 5. That's forcing him to then adapt what it is that he's doing. Likewise, if you reward him for, if you can receive and play forwards, then it's worth 5 as well. So the practice design can be really clever with the constraints manipulation, as well as it being directed from the coach.
Thanks, Dave. We're pretty much there for time, so I'll pass back to Gary. But thanks for Alex and William for submitting new questions, and thanks for Phil and Dave for answering them really well. So, Gary.
Yeah, some awesome discussion and insights there from our speakers today, and I guess I'm drawn to think about the importance of my practice and my practice on my players' ability to therefore practice different skills in different settings under different circumstances, but also drawn to think about how players are afforded the opportunity to practice learning too, which is also a very complex process and a whole new can of worms to open, which I'm sure we will explore in future sessions if we're lucky enough to have Phil and Dave back on our webinar series in the future. But just again, I'd like to just say a huge thank you to Dave and Philip, and also to Declan too for his co-hosting with me today. And thank you for tuning in to all of our audience members, and we hope that we see you on our next iCoach Kids Shares webinar series, which will be hosted on July the 22nd, so not too far away now, where we'll be focusing on movement skills. So please stay tuned to our social media channels for opportunities to sign up, and we look forward to seeing you there. Finally, also keep an eye out on our social media channels for the launch of our brand new iCoach Kids website, which will be coming to you in the next few weeks. So stay tuned, stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks, everybody.